In 1989, Jordan Mechner, a young college graduate, introduced a 2D platformer called Prince of Persia to the world. Platformers were all the rage during the 80s, yet Mechner's set itself apart from its contemporaries with its weighty, swashbuckling action and incredibly smooth animations, a feat that he had achieved by rotoscoping footage of his family and friends into the game. Mechner's platformer would be followed by a strong sequel and a myriad of enhanced ports, which would trickle out over the next decade on nearly every platform under the sun. After a disappointing foray into the third dimension, however, the series would briefly recess, only for it to be reinvigorated by Ubisoft's Montreal subsidiary, which would imbue it with a stylish sense of motion and a reality-bending gameplay mechanic now as iconic as the series itself. Prince of Persia's new champions would continue to nurture it for many years after, until finally, after a polarizing reboot and a middling attempt to bring it to the silver screen, the decision was made to put it on hold. Despite its developers' best intentions, the series' spark had seemingly vanished. But the mark it had left on both the industry and gamers around the world would never fade. This is the rise and fall of Prince of Persia. In 1984, Jordan Mechner released Karateka for the Apple II, an action game set in feudal Japan. Karateka had been developed by Mechner over the course of 2 years as a side project during his time at university. While its entertaining story and addictive gameplay engrossed many, players were especially captivated by the fluidity of Karateka's animations, which Mechner had achieved by rotoscoping recordings of his mother's karate instructor performing various moves. Rotoscoping had been used in animated movies for many years prior, with filmmakers such as Don Bluth and Ralph Bakshi heavily relying on the technique during the production of most of their feature-length movies in the 1970s and 80s. But Karateka had been one of the very first video games to make use of it. As Mechner completed his degree and collected Karateka's residuals, he thought long and hard about what he wanted to do next. Rotorbun Software, which had published Karateka, wanted him to make Karateka 2. But Mechner dreamed of an entirely different experience, one that mixed the swashbuckling action of Indiana Jones with the aesthetics and motifs of Arabian literature, like 1001 Nights. Not only was the latter visually distinctive and familiar, being nestled in the collective unconscious of people across the globe, but it also hadn't been featured as a setting in many other games up until then. Initially, Mechner was reluctant to go through with this idea. Karateka had been fairly lucrative, but he wanted to pursue a career as a screenwriter in Hollywood, and there was no guarantee whether the video game market would still be around in the coming years. In the end, however, the project's allure proved too hard to resist, and Mechner partnered up with Broderbund again to start development on what would become known as Prince of Persia. The road to Prince of Persia's release would be pockmarked with both triumphs and frustrations. As with Karateka, Mechner was able to bring the game's characters to life in extraordinary fashion, this time by rotoscoping footage of his brother, David, whom he filmed running, jumping, and performing stunts while wearing baggy white pants early on in the game's production. He was also able to digitally copy the likeness of a couple of willing colleagues, as well as a few frames from the 1938 film The Adventures of Robin Hood. While the process of converting all of them into digital assets was complicated, they ultimately provided Prince of Persia's animations with a level of smoothness that Mechner would have been unable to achieve any other way. Yet Mechner would also consistently struggle to make Prince of Persia an enjoyable gameplay experience. Originally, he wanted Prince of Persia to be more of a puzzle game with a heavily modular design, like the Broderbund-published Lode Runner or the Castles of Dr. Creep. Players would run, jump, and solve puzzles across 50-odd levels, after which they'd be able to create puzzles of their own with a level editor. But those who tested this iteration of the game found it to be unrewarding. The challenges it contained pushed one's intellect and reflexes to their limits, yet few felt motivated to continue playing. Eventually, Mechner realized that much like how a film's plot doesn't progress until the main character wants something, the player wouldn't move forward in his game until they want something too. As a result, he would spend the remainder of Prince of Persia's development completely retooling it, adding sword-wielding enemies for the player to defeat, as well as stronger indicators of their progress, in order to provide the player with a more continuous sense of accomplishment and make them want to move forward. At the same time, Prince of Persia's level count was reduced to 12, and its level editor was gutted. But when the game would finally release on the Apple II in October of 1989, these losses would prove to be of little consequence. One day, in an ancient Persian kingdom forgotten by time, Jafar, the evil vizier of the kingdom's sultan, locks the sultan's daughter up in the palace's highest tower and offers her a choice: marry him or die within the hour. Jafar vies to seize the kingdom's throne and believes that his ultimatum with the princess will deliver it to him. But standing between Jafar and his ambitions is a most unlikely obstacle: a meager prince, whom the princess had already fallen in love with, and Jafar had previously incarcerated in the palace's deepest dungeon. With the clock ticking on his beloved's life, the prince embarks on a mad dash to rescue her, braving all manner of puzzles and perils as he races to her location. Prince of Persia would be critically lauded upon its release, with pundits hailing the quality of its animations as well as its Hollywood-inspired sense of action. The game was unabashed about making sure that every move performed by the player carried with it a sense of weight, both literal and metaphorical, unseen in most other games at the time. Yet it also wasn't afraid to subvert its own tropes and force the player to think outside the box to overcome their adversaries. The only aspect where Prince of Persia fell short was its sales. While the video game market as a whole had not disappeared by the time of Prince of Persia's release, the Apple II's market had, resulting in the game initially moving few units. However, its sales would rebound tremendously after ports of Prince of Persia arrived on the Macintosh, as well as almost every home and portable video game console available at the time. These ports, which were sometimes developed independently of Mechner or Broderbund's influence, would often improve upon Mechner's base game in unique ways, adding significantly enhanced graphics, additional levels, and even voice acting in one instance.
Don't worry. When the Sultan returns, everything will be all right.
Prince of Persia had become a hit with gamers across the globe and taken the crown as one of Broderbund's most well-known titles. But the long and protracted road to its release had left Mechner weary. In Edge magazine's 2013 retrospective of the first two games' development, Mechner would explain that after jumping straight out of college to work in the industrial park for half a decade, he desperately wanted to do other things with his time, such as nurse his passion for filmmaking. As a result, Mechner would take an extended break from game development, spending the next several years studying and traveling across America and Europe. Yet he continued to remain in contact with Broderbund throughout his sabbatical, and would eventually agree to help produce a sequel to Prince of Persia. Unlike the first Prince of Persia, which evolved sporadically over the 4 years that he worked on it, its sequel would come together in a highly regimented and decentralized fashion. During his time abroad, Mechner would write an intricate 200-page design document of everything that he wanted the sequel to contain, and sent it to a team back at Broderbund that would turn his vision into reality. Mechner would later express disdain for having chosen to produce the sequel in this manner, explaining on his personal website in 2013 that because games typically evolve so quickly, any design that gets put on paper is usually out of date by the time anyone reads it, let alone a design document that details every single aspect of one's game. However, thanks in large part to the Broderbund's team's willingness to stringently follow Mechner's instructions and not evolve them, the sequel came together smoothly and would release in 1993. Titled Prince of Persia 2: The Shadow and the Flame, the game picks up shortly after where the first left off, following the prince on a journey of danger and self-discovery after Jafar changes his appearance to that of a beggar, banishes him from the palace, and maroons him on a treacherous island. In contrast to its predecessor, The Shadow and the Flame features a much broader selection of locales and more varied perils and enemies, but the player is still required to complete all of the game's challenges within a short time limit, lest the princess once again die at Jafar's hands. The Shadow and the Flame would quickly endear itself to both fans old and new, and sell much more strongly on home computers than its predecessor. Nevertheless, while most agree that the game represented a marked improvement over what had come before, Mechner himself would lament in his Edge magazine retrospective that it ultimately broke little new ground. And even though it was more immediately successful, The Shadow and the Flame would ultimately find its way to much fewer platforms than the first Prince of Persia, with the Super Nintendo being the only home console to receive a port of it in the decade that would follow.
The people rejoiced, and the prince and princess dwelt together in joy and serenity, and lived happily ever after.
At the conclusion of The Shadow and the Flame, the player is given a brief glimpse of a mysterious witch, who is revealed to have been secretly observing the prince's adventures from afar. The witch, as Mechner would later disclose, is an arch-villainess who played a gruesome role in the prince's past, and was destined to torment him once more in what would have been Prince of Persia 3. The game would never materialize, however, with Mechner instead spending the next 4 years working on The Last Express for Broderbund, an adventure game set aboard the Orient Express in the early 20th century. The Last Express lacked Prince of Persia's Arabian trappings, yet retained its love of fluid motion graphics, with the game featuring some 40,000 frames of rotoscoped animation. Unfortunately, while The Last Express would be showered in accolades, it would fail to find an audience, and became a massive financial sinkhole following its release. Mechner was none too pleased and briefly contemplated leaving the video game industry for good. But before he could, Andrew Peterson of Red Orb Entertainment, Broderbund's newly formed core gaming division, asked for his help in making a 3D Prince of Persia game. Despite everything that he had experienced with The Last Express, Mechner couldn't refuse and joined the project as a writer and designer. Initially, the development of the Prince of Persia series' first foray into 3D was high-spirited and confident. Everyone on the team had either worked directly on a previous Prince of Persia title or was immensely passionate about the franchise. And while they could no longer use old shortcuts such as rotoscoping, the team now had much more powerful tools at their disposal that would help bring the game's characters to life. But then, around halfway through the project's development, Peterson's team would be unexpectedly neutered by circumstances larger than itself. While Broderbund's employees were busy plugging away at its products, Broderbund itself had been acquired by the Learning Company in the summer of 1998, after struggling financially during the previous 2 years. As part of its efforts to streamline operations within its new purchase, the Learning Company would begin curtailing and reorganizing its assets, laying off around 500 Broderbund employees in September of 1998 alone. The Prince of Persia team was allowed to remain, but given significantly less time to complete their work than initially planned. As a result, when the simply titled Prince of Persia 3D would release on the PC in August of the following year, players would be treated to a game that felt at odds with the level of talent that had worked on it. "3D's story, which revolves around the prince pursuing Rudnor, a half-man, half-tiger hybrid who has absconded with the princess in a distant land, was decently entertaining. And its animations, as well as the overall artistic direction of its world, were as sharp as one would expect from a Prince of Persia title. But in order to navigate 3D's world, one needed to grapple with a host of mechanical shortcomings, including sluggish, tank-like movement controls and an unwieldy camera. It was clear to many that 3D's rush development had deprived its creators of time to fine-tune it, something that the game's Dreamcast port, Prince of Persia Arabian Nights, would only mildly address when it would release the following year. Beyond this, pundits would also bemoan how close 3D felt to the Tomb Raider series. It was understandable that the game's creators would look to other more popular platforming games set within three-dimensional spaces during its development, in order to help ease Prince of Persia's leap into this realm. Yet 3D evoked Lara Croft's adventures a little too closely for comfort, something that Mechner himself would later acknowledge. In early 2001, 2 years after 3D's release, the rights to the Prince of Persia name found their way into the hands of Ubisoft. While the French company saw value in Mechner's adventurous series, it would be Ubisoft Montreal, its relatively new Canadian subsidiary, that would be charged with taking the series in a new direction. Ubisoft Montreal had been established in 1997 and had spent the first 4 years of its existence developing licensed games for children, such as Tarzan Untamed and Donald Duck Goin' Quackers. None of their titles had been particularly well received, but the studio showed enough potential that when opportunities arose to work on more substantial projects at the turn of the century, they were given the ability to do so. A new Prince of Persia game was one such project. From the moment its rights had been scooped up, Ubisoft saw considerable potential in the Dormant series and wanted to commence development on a new three-dimensional reboot of it as soon as possible. There was only one problem. Even though the company now possessed the Prince of Persia name, Mechner still held the intellectual property rights to the franchise. Knowing he likely wouldn't cooperate unless he saw something with a high level of potential, the higher-ups at Ubisoft tasked a team in Montreal, led by producer Yannis Mallah, who had previously demanded to work on Prince of Persia following its acquisition, with making something that would compel him to sign on. After a short period of conceptualization, Malah's team conceived a ninja-like interpretation of the series' protagonist, one who would run along walls and perform acrobatic feats well beyond the ability of any prior prince. Mechner was presented with test animations of this character in action, and was almost immediately sold. Not only was Ubisoft Montreal's vision for what they wanted Prince of Persia to be thrilling to watch, it was also utterly unlike the plodding Tomb Raider-like experience seen in 3D, which Mechner had feared the studio would attempt to emulate. But before production on the game would begin in rigor, Mallah wanted it to feature something more, a gameplay keystone that would help further distinguish it from its contemporaries. Patrice Desilets, the game's newly appointed creative director, proposed allowing the prince to rewind time. As Jeff Keighley's The Final Hours of Prince of Persia would reveal after the game's release, Desilets had previously wanted to implement a time rewinding feature into Donald Duck Goin' Quackers to make it so that he didn't have to replay entire levels whenever he died in-game, and felt that the prince's newest adventure would benefit equally from such a mechanic. The idea was a hit, and the team got to work on building a game around it. While these early mechanical and stylistic breakthroughs impassioned many at Ubisoft Montreal, the bulk of the game's creation would be far from a cakewalk. Developing the prince's animations and mechanics left the team strapped for resources to develop the enemies he would fight. And only 3 months before the game was to be first shown off to the public at the 2003 Electronic Entertainment Expo, its original engine had to be abandoned after its programmers realized that it couldn't support the project's current scope. The final few months of its production would prove especially brutal, after Ubisoft's higher-ups demanded that the game be finished in time for the winter of 2003. Everyone became so pinched for time that the team even briefly considered splitting the game into 2 halves, with the second half to release the following year. Thankfully, unlike 3D before it, the rushed nature of its final hours would fail to neuter it. Instead, Ubisoft Montreal's opus, Prince of Persia: The Sands of Time, would become a smash hit following its launch on the GameCube, PlayStation 2, Xbox, and PC in November of 2003. Players found plenty to enjoy in the game's story, which sees a new incarnation of the prince embark on a quest to save the world, alongside Farah, an Indian princess, after being tricked into unleashing the mystical sands of time and turning everyone around him into monsters. Yet equally loved would be the game's puzzles, platforming, and combat, which players found both immensely intuitive as well as respectful to those of the series' past. And the prince's time manipulation ability, beyond helping undo mistakes, proved immensely fun to toy around with by itself. Not all of the Sands of Time's versions would astound equally, with critics coming down harder on its PC release for featuring less refined movement and camera controls. The Sands of Time would also receive an adaptation for the Game Boy Advance, which, while far from abhorred, would fail to garner the same enthusiasm as its home console brethren. A 2D, sprite-based platformer in the style of the first 2 Prince of Persia titles, the Game Boy Advance version of the Sands of Time allows one to both manipulate time and swap between the prince and Farah, features that would leave critics impressed, but not enough to forgive the game's overall lack of polish. In the end, however, these small mishaps would do little to abate the core release's popularity. The Sands of Time would go on to garner awards and accolades from across the industry, and sell tremendously well over the next decade, with IGN revealing in 2014 that the game had sold 14 million copies across all of its platforms. Ubisoft Montreal's reputation as a premier AAA developer was cemented, and Ubisoft as a whole gained a new mascot in the form of the Sands of Time's Prince, who would join Rayman and Sam Fisher of Splinter Cell fame as a formative member of the French company's burgeoning brand identity. However, as fans would soon discover, it was a mascot that Ubisoft wasn't afraid to radically change.
Ready your weapons!
12 months after the Sands of Time, Ubisoft Montreal would release Prince of Persia: Warrior Within in November 2004. Taking place 7 years after the events of the former game, Warrior Within sees the prince become embroiled in a fight against fate itself after discovering that he is being pursued by the Dahaka, a temporal guardian tasked with ending his life and undoing his past exploits. While not hugely different mechanically from the Sands of Time, the game's presentation is much bloodier and edgier than any previous incarnation of the series, complete with heavy metal riffs, scantily clad vixens, and some of the most depraved dialogue to ever emerge from the prince's mouth.
You should be honored to die by my sword!
The decision to take Warrior Within in this direction had come about as a result of Ubisoft Montreal desiring to broaden the sequel's appeal, as well as wanting to relay a story in which the prince would deal with the consequences of his actions from the first game. Consequences that he had typically been able to avoid thanks to his time manipulation powers. Some felt the studio's execution of these designs to be strong, with many citing the game's combat in particular as being much improved over that of Ubisoft Montreal's previous entry. Others found it disappointing, including Jordan Mechner himself. Unlike the Sands of Time, Warrior Within had been made entirely without Mechner's help, and he was none too pleased with the results, commenting to Wired in 2005 that he disapproved of its crudeness and violence. From his perspective, Prince of Persia was at its best when it was for all ages, not when it was trying to appeal exclusively to angst-ridden teenagers. Criticisms such as these, as well as Warrior Within's weaker financial performance than that of the Sands of Time, would lead Ubisoft Montreal to attempt to reconcile their series' light and dark halves in December of 2005 with Prince of Persia: The Two Thrones.
It is the Prince of Persia!
That can't be.
He's come back to us.
It is good to see you safe.
Set immediately after Warrior Within, The Two Thrones returns to many of the characters and locales first featured in the Sands of Time, but introduces a new foil for the prince to contend with: the Dark Prince, a cruel and self-serving alter ego who has manifested within his mind. Beyond serving as a narrative embodiment of the previous two games' disparate tones, the alter ego also occasionally takes over the protagonist's physical body in the middle of the Two Thrones levels, granting him enhanced combative and acrobatic abilities until the prince touches a body of water. The Two Thrones would be well received across the industry, with many critics hailing it as a solid return to form after Warrior Within's aberrations. The Dark Prince segments would be derided for being more mind-numbing than engaging, but almost everything else the game did reminded many a player why they had first fallen for Ubisoft's interpretation of the franchise back in 2003. Less beloved would be the Battles of Prince of Persia, a turn-based tactics game for the Nintendo DS that would launch concurrently with The Two Thrones. Taking place in the interim between the Sands of Time and Warrior Within, Battles would be praised for the depth of its tactical gameplay, which involves the player using specialized playing cards to issue orders to their troops, yet criticized for its hollow and uninspired presentation, which struggled to evoke the same sense of wonder or excitement as the home console games. Prince of Persia: Revelations, a port of Warrior Within for the PlayStation Portable, would also launch during this time to a middling reception. But with The Two Thrones occupying most players' attention, it was easy to ignore these releases' faults. Following the conclusion of the Sands of Time trilogy, the Prince of Persia series would briefly fade into the background of the video game industry. A port of The Two Thrones titled Prince of Persia: Rival Swords would arrive on the Wii and the PlayStation Portable in April of 2007, and a 2.5D remake of the original 1989 game titled Prince of Persia Classic would also release on Xbox Live Arcade in July. But for the most part, the series held back, letting other, more fledgling properties establish themselves on the latest generation of video game consoles in its place, including a new series from Ubisoft Montreal that had been directly derived from it, called Assassin's Creed. The seeds of what would eventually become Assassin's Creed had taken root at Ubisoft immediately upon the Sands of Time's release. After serving as the creative director on the Sands of Time, Patrice Désilets wanted to do away with the prince as the game's protagonist for its sequel, explaining in a 2012 interview with Edge magazine that from his perspective, a prince isn't an action figure. He's just someone who's waiting to become king. Instead, Désilets wanted the next Prince of Persia game's royal heir to be an AI-controlled child, with the player taking control of a deadly assassin tasked with protecting the young prince's life. While this project, which would gestate as a spin-off titled Prince of Persia Assassins for a period of time, would ultimately lose most of its connections to its progenitor's narrative, it would retain key aspects of its gameplay, such as its emphasis on parkour. And when it would finally release as Assassin's Creed for the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3 in November of 2007, it would gain a sizable following, moving over 10 million units across all platforms. Prince of Persia could have easily followed in Assassin's Creed's footsteps and offered a grim, hyper-realistic reimagining of its universe for its first outing on Microsoft and Sony's high-definition consoles. But instead, it would go in the complete opposite direction. After the conclusion of the Sands of Time trilogy, Ubisoft Montreal wanted to experiment with the franchise and see if they could shape its core systems and tropes into a completely different mold than what had been offered before. As producer Ben Mattis would explain in a 2008 interview with IGN, the team decided early on that they wanted to reinvent this series as an art house-like game, one that would attempt to marry the bombast and production values of the biggest AAA titles with the soft, serene feel of indie hits like Flower or Journey. Where previous Prince of Persia games would try to instill satisfaction in the player by having them overcome challenging and frustrating setbacks, they wanted their game to offer a Zen experience, wherein the player would find pleasure in the sheer act of taking part in its digital odyssey. In addition to this, the team also wanted to integrate the prince's female companion more deeply into the game's story and mechanics, as well as have the prince himself evolve from a roguish delinquent into a more good-hearted individual over the course of his journey, in the vein of characters like Han Solo from Star Wars. All of these aspirations would culminate in the simply titled Prince of Persia, which would release on the Xbox 360, PlayStation 3, and PC in December of 2008.
Oh, crap!
How did you... Whoa! I've got you.
A reboot of the series, Prince of Persia sees the prince team up with a magically endowed princess named Elika, who aspires to save the world from the dark god Ahriman and his corrupting influence. While this prince possesses no time-manipulating abilities, Elika more than makes up for this, helping him traverse the game's environments, smite his enemies, and escape death whenever he comes face to face with it, making it impossible for the player to ever die during the game. In addition, many of the platforming maneuvers and acrobatics that the player is forced to perform are more simplified than what was offered in previous titles, with the prince and Elika often able to dash through entire levels with extreme ease. Reactions to the reboot would range the spectrum. Players almost universally agreed that the painterly art direction of the game's world was superb, and that Elika was as endearing as she was strong-willed. Yet opinions varied on both how enjoyable this world was to actually play through, as well as how palatable Elika's partner was. Some found the experience of flying through the reboot's levels to be exhilarating, and the prince a sympathetic, if not emotionally nuanced, character, while others expressed disappointment at the level's lack of challenge, and felt that the prince barely evolved from the loudmouth jerk he started as at the beginning of the game.
Yeah, and you can run too.
Perhaps most contentious would be the reboot's refusal to let the player die. Some accepted it, arguing that it was no different than how the Sands of Time trilogy allowed players to rewind themselves out of death's clutches. Others didn't, pointing out that while it was true that the trilogy's time rewinding powers allowed one to do so, one couldn't rewind indefinitely in those games. Avoiding death in the Sands of Time and its sequels still felt tense, whereas doing so in the reboot did not, which in turn made any accomplishments the player overcame in the reboot feel more muted. In the aforementioned IGN interview, Mattis would express pride at what he and his fellow workers achieved with Prince of Persia, arguing that in an industry that is often criticized for shipping carbon copies of proven formulas, they produced something that felt truly different. However, he would acknowledge that the game could have done a better job of providing more challenge to players that weren't looking for a laid-back experience, and that the game's dialogue system had been inadequate at demonstrating the prince's character development. And while the reboot wouldn't perform too badly at retail, with over 2 million copies of the game finding their way into people's homes following its release, its sales would ultimately not prove strong enough to bring about a sequel, which both the game's ending and Mattis himself would hint at. Nonetheless, players looking to further explore the world of the 2008 reboot could also check out Prince of Persia: The Fallen King for the DS on the same day as the former. A two-dimensional platformer that takes place after the events of the reboot, The Fallen King would prove less than popular due to its unique control scheme, which forces the player to use the DS's touchscreen to carry out almost every action imaginable, from jumping over pits to performing magic. While occasionally intuitive, most found the touch controls to be more imprecise than not, ruining what could have otherwise been a novel experience. Ubisoft would also release an epilogue to the reboot in March of 2009 on the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3, which would provide a limited amount of closure to the game's final moments.
Set, Mike.
In May of 2010, less than 2 years after the 2008 reboot, the Prince of Persia series would come roaring back to life once more with a cavalcade of cross-media content. At the center of it was Prince of Persia: The Sands of Time, a feature film adaptation of the 2003 game produced by Jerry Bruckheimer. The Sands of Time film had been gestating since March of 2004, when Bruckheimer's production company first attempted to acquire the film rights to Ubisoft's original reboot of the series. Unlike most prior video game movies, which typically tended to spurn help from the people who helped conceive their source material, the Sands of Time film's executives would quickly enlist Mechner's help, who in turn would graciously assist in its production over the course of the next 6 years. Despite this, the film would be received tepidly upon its release. Critics generally agreed that it made for an entertaining, if not shallow, viewing experience, yet its box office would struggle to recoup its budget, even after receiving strong support from overseas. Unfortunately, this tepidness would carry over to Prince of Persia: The Forgotten Sands. Released concurrently with the movie, The Forgotten Sands, which returns to the universe, prince, and core mechanics of the Sands of Time trilogy, would release on nearly every video game platform of note, with the Wii, DS, and PlayStation Portable versions of the game featuring completely different storylines and gameplay conceits than those of the PC, Xbox 360, and PlayStation 3 version of the game. Of the Forgotten Sands' 4 different iterations, the Wii version would stick out as something of a pleasant surprise. Taking place in a mysterious ruined kingdom bequeathed to the prince by a genie, the Wii version would be praised for its inspired art direction, strong level design, and clever integration of its console's motion functionality, with the player able to create various affordances that the prince can take advantage of during the game's platforming segments, such as hooks or whirlwinds of air, with a flick of a Wii remote. That it still looked like a game from a generation ago was disappointing, as was its combat, which many felt leaned too heavily into mindless waggling. As a whole, however, fans were impressed with how much effort had been poured into it, given how sparse the Wii's third-party support usually was. The PC, Xbox 360, and PlayStation 3 version of the game, on the other hand, would be met with mild disappointment. Critics appreciated its level design as well as some of the new mechanics it featured, such as allowing the prince to freeze and then climb on streams of water in midair. Yet everything else about the experience seemed to lack the oomph that had made its predecessors so celebrated, with players finding the game's story, which involves the prince's brother Malik unleashing an army of monsters upon his kingdom, to be especially forgettable. The PlayStation Portable version, a 2.5D platformer, would be commended for the quality of its level design, yet criticized for its control issues and difficulty. And the DS version, another 2.5D platformer, would fail to inspire many followers with its touch-based control scheme, which critics found to be woefully imprecise. By the standards of movie tie-in games, The Forgotten Sands' many different versions were respectable, but by the standards of the trilogy of games they harkened back to, they were lacking. And unfortunately for Ubisoft, their sales would fail to make up for this. The Forgotten Sands games would be followed up by high-definition remasters of the Sands of Time trilogy, which would release separately on the PlayStation Store in late 2010, and then together as a collection during the spring of 2011. While the remasters satisfied many longtime fans looking to relive the glories of the series' past, they would also end up being one of their last tastes of anything Prince of Persia for some time. Aside from a 2.5D remake of The Shadow and the Flame, and an endless runner game titled Prince of Persia Time Run, which would find their way onto mobile devices in 2013 and 2015 respectively, the franchise would effectively go dormant in the wake of the trilogy's re-release, with Yanis Mallah telling IGN in January of 2013 that it was effectively paused for the foreseeable future. Many have pointed to Assassin's Creed's popularity as being the biggest reason for Prince of Persia's abandonment. In addition to its similarities to Prince of Persia likely making Ubisoft concerned that supporting both would be redundant as time went on, Assassin's Creed has performed much more strongly at retail than its spiritual predecessor ever did on a consistent basis, with nearly every new entry in the history-hopping franchise selling upwards of 10 million units. Others have also argued that Ubisoft didn't do itself any favors releasing as many Prince of Persia titles as it did during the series' heyday. Rather than attempt to focus on producing a few polished experiences for one or two platforms, the company tried to constantly bring Prince of Persia to every platform under the sun, stretching themselves thin and leaving consumers fatigued. That the Prince's final outings not only emphasized this trend, but were considered by most to be some of the series' weaker entries, and were accompanied by a lackluster movie, most certainly didn't help matters. Regardless, rumors and leaks of all origins purporting the existence of new games would continue to pop up in the years following the trilogy's re-release. One particularly tantalizing leak would occur in August of 2012, when a user on Ubisoft's official forums would post a screenshot of what they claimed was a new Prince of Persia game. The screenshot, which featured a muscular, dark-skinned individual standing in what appeared to be ancient Egypt, had the term POP02 displayed at the bottom of it, a term similar to Prince of Persia Zero, which had been an early codename for the 2008 reboot. However, Mechner would refute this on Twitter soon after, and evidence would later suggest that the screenshot came instead from an original project that was briefly being worked on at Ubisoft Montreal, codenamed Osiris. Then in April of 2013, Climax Studios, the British video game developer best known for Silent Hill Shattered Memories, would grab headlines after uploading various screenshots of what appeared to be a new 2.5D Prince of Persia game to its website. Climax CEO Simon Gardner would tell Engadget shortly after that they were from a prototype created in 2012 during exploratory discussions with Ubisoft, but would stop short of stating whether it was a Prince of Persia prototype. He would also confirm that regardless, the project had not gone any further than what had been shared. Finally, in April of 2014, French website Porta de Jeux Video would report that a new 2D Prince of Persia game utilizing the UbiArt framework was in production. Unfortunately, no further information on this project would emerge, and given Ubisoft's waning interest in the framework, it remains unlikely that it ever will. All the while these leaks and rumors have percolated, the franchise's gatekeepers have continued to reassure fans publicly that a new major Prince of Persia title can and will still happen. Though the further time has gone on, the more their comments have expressed as much exasperation as they do hope. In an exchange on Twitter in January of 2018, Mechner would claim that both he and plenty of people that he knew were interested in seeing Prince of Persia return, and that they were doing their best to make it happen. Likewise, in an interview with Game Informer in October of the same year, Ubisoft CEO Sergei Hoskoway would state that they were fighting for the resources necessary to bring back Splinter Cell and Prince of Persia, stating that, to them, it's not a question of will, it's a question of means. While it is unclear when and where Prince of Persia will emerge next, the circumstances for it to return remain ripe. The series is still beloved by many, enough so that it continues to dwell strongly within the public consciousness of gamers across the globe. And even though Assassin's Creed not only still exists, but has gradually become more and more action-oriented in recent years, it's still not so similar to Prince of Persia that one could argue it has made the latter irrelevant. They overlap in various and obvious ways, but they can still coexist. Prince of Persia has existed for almost as long as the video game industry itself. It has endured setbacks and hardships many times before, and unless something cataclysmic should happen, it will likely endure the ones currently in front of it, no matter how long it takes. Our documentaries are crowdfunded and made possible by the generous supporters backing us on Patreon. If you enjoy our content, consider subscribing to our channel and becoming a patron to help us create more. Thank you.